In a mountainous kingdom veiled by mist and ruled by tradition, Nyasha was born during a thunderstorm. Her first cry silenced the howling winds, and the village elders said she had swallowed the roar of the storm. The oracle declared her marked by the spirits, destined to become the spiritual bride of the king, a living conduit between the heavens and the throne. She was taken from her family before she could walk, raised in the temple atop the cliffside, where clouds touched stone and birds sang prayers to the sky. She was not taught songs or tales. Instead, she learned silence, stillness, and sacrifice. They fed her herbs to still her mind and taught her to listen for the voices of the ancestors in the wind. Her beauty was undeniable, skin like wet bronze, eyes the color of night skies before lightning. The priests painted symbols on her back and told her she was holy, untouchable, unseen. The king Omukama Age visited her only once during her growing years, to inspect what the gods had sent him. He was draped in lion skins, crowned in gold and flanked by warriors, but Nyasha barely noticed him. Her attention was pulled to the storm outside, the rumbling skies whispering secrets no one else could hear. By the time she was 16, the rituals had begun. She was dressed in white and carried barefoot through the streets once a year during the festival of ancestral rains. It was said her presence alone was enough to bring peace to the skies, and indeed, whenever she stepped outside, the winds stilled. Children peeked at her from behind carved doorways. Elders dropped to their knees. And still she did not smile. She did not speak. She belonged to something greater than them all. But Omukama Age was a man of conquest, not faith. He expanded his kingdom through war, not prayer. As he aged, his hunger turned from land to legacy, and whispers began in court. Why had he not taken a true queen? His advisors pushed him to choose a political bride. A foreign princess arrived, her fingers heavy with rings, her laughter light and easy. Nyasha, locked away in her tower, sensed the shift before anyone spoke a word. The wind no longer brought messages of joy. The spirits grew quiet. During one ritual, her silence was interrupted by a soft hum, not from her lips, but from the iron anklets they made her wear. They rang with a rhythm that echoed through the temple halls, a melody the priests had never heard. The next morning she was summoned by the king. He sat on his golden throne with the foreign princess beside him, her hand on his. Nyasha stood barefoot, her white robe soaked in rain from her long walk down the mountain. She did not bow. She did not speak. The king narrowed his eyes. "You do not smile. You do not dance. You do not entertain," he said. "Are you a bride or a ghost?" Nyasha simply blinked. The torches around the hall flickered. Thunder growled in the distance. The king rose. "If the gods wanted me bound to silence, they would have sent a stone. I will no longer carry your burden. Let the gods keep you." She was taken to the dungeons that same night, her white garments ripped from her, replaced with chains and coarse cloth. The stone walls were damp, and the only sound was the drip of water and the scrape of rats. But Nyasha did not cry. She touched the iron around her wrists and it hummed. She whispered to it. The chains began to sing. Above, preparations began for the king's grand wedding. The foreign princess bathed in milk, gold lanterns lined the palace halls, and the villagers were promised feasts and music. Drummers practiced for days, their hands raw from beating skins. But every night as the sky darkened, the wind would pick up and howl around the palace towers. No one could sleep. No one could find peace. The storm did not strike with lightning or rain, it struck with memory. Servants dreamed of Nyasha's silent face. The king tossed in his bed, hearing chains clink beneath the floor. His bride-to-be shivered without reason, whispering that someone was watching her through the mirrors. Still the day arrived. The kingdom gathered beneath banners and trumpets. The king stood tall in his red and gold robes, his bride radiant beside him. The priests lifted their hands to the sky. Then, it began. Not the ceremony but a sound. Low and steady. Metallic and mournful. The chains. From the deepest cell beneath the palace they rang. Softly at first like a bell in fog. Then louder. Clink, clink, clink. The wedding guests looked at each other. The wind picked up. The sky, once clear, darkened with unnatural speed. And then, a voice. Not spoken but felt. In the bones. In the heart. You locked away what calmed the storm. You crowned silence with mockery. Now hear her chain song. The palace trembled. The gold banners tore themselves from the walls. The wedding torches blew out. The bride screamed as the mirrors around her cracked, not from heat or impact, but from something inside them trying to get out. The dungeon door burst open. Nyasha emerged, chains dragging behind her like a river of metal. but she did not stumble. She walked with the poise of a queen, her steps slow, deliberate. The air around her shimmered with something unseen, a pressure, a presence. The guards could not move. The priests fell to their knees. The foreign bride collapsed, her lips whispering apologies to gods she had never believed in. The king, mouth open, watched as Nyasha stepped onto the marble floor. The chains rang louder now, not with heaviness but purpose. Each link sang of betrayal, of injustice, of a promise broken. Nyasha lifted her head. Her eyes glowed white. The storm came all at once. Thunder shattered the palace roof. Rain poured like morning tears. Lightning struck the throne itself, splitting it down the middle. The king screamed, but no one could hear him over the song. Nyasha did not touch him. She did not need to. The chains uncoiled from her wrists and wrapped around his feet. They did not bind him, they judged him. They told the truth. He had taken what was not his. He had defied the spirits. And now they would take from him. The king vanished in a burst of wind, leaving only his crown spinning on the ground, scorched at its tips. Nyasha turned to the people, still stunned in their places. She opened her mouth. And for the first time in years she spoke. I was not yours to keep. With that, she vanished. The wind carried her away, the storm following her steps. To this day, in that mountainous kingdom, no king has dared to marry without first offering prayers at the cliffs. No bride wears white unless she has wept for Nyasha. And on wedding nights, if the air is too still, people wait, listening for the soft clink of chains. Because somewhere the bride of the storm still walks. And her silence still sings. Under the heavy stone foundations of the king's palace, where the air was thick with damp and decay, Nyasha sat in silence. Her wrists bore the cold bite of iron chains, rusted with age and neglect. She had been cast into the dungeon not for crime, but for defying expectation. The king, once enthralled by the calm power that rolled off her like mist, her silences that calmed storms, her presence that tamed even the wildest animals, had grown bored. She did not speak as he wished. She did not perform the rituals as quickly as the priests demanded. And so she had been discarded. Locked in the belly of the castle, she became little more than myth. The dungeon was a place forgotten by all but the guards who descended to deliver food or check the locks. Even they avoided lingering. For soon after Nyasha's arrival, the darkness changed. At first, it was subtle, a slight echo in places where there had been none, or the feeling of not being alone when clearly there was no one else. One guard, a young boy named Amu, claimed he heard humming on his first night watch. Sweet and slow, the melody lulled him into a dream of waves and rain. When he awoke, the torches had all burned low, and Nyasha's chains were stretched across the cell as though she'd paced all night, though she never stirred in his view. More stories followed. Another guard heard laughter, light like bells, during the fiercest thunderstorm the mountain had seen. When he rushed to check on her, Nyasha was seated as always, her eyes closed, her lips unmoving. But the storm ceased moments later, the sky clearing with unnatural speed. Rumors spread like wildfire through the palace halls. She sings to the sky, they whispered. She binds spirits in her chains. One night, a senior guard named Beko was sent down after the king received complaints of unease among the dungeon watch. He scoffed at tales of singing in shadows. But when he entered the hallway to Nyasha's cell, his bravado faltered. The air was warm, not from fire but from breath, as though the corridor exhaled. And the chains, they were moving. Not wildly but with intention. They coiled and stretched, not bound by gravity or her limbs. They danced slowly like vines seeking sun. He called for backup, but when others arrived, the chains lay still, silent, harmless. They mocked him. Nyasha spoke for the first time in weeks, but only to him. You should not have come alone, she said gently. Some chains are not made by men. Beko left without a word and never returned to the dungeon. Meanwhile, the king, distracted by a new bride and plans for a lavish wedding, ignored all tales of the girl below. His court laughed at the guard's stories, calling them weak-hearted. But beneath the palace, something old stirred. At midnight, on moonless nights, shadows twisted along the dungeon walls, forming the shape of hands, of wings, of faces. The torches burned cold blue. The chains no longer only moved, they sang. Each clink, each rattle, formed part of a mournful lullaby that wrapped itself around the minds of the guards and the stone itself. Nyasha remained calm. She knew what stirred. Long ago her mother had warned her, if they lock you away, do not scream. The spirits will hear. And the mountain remembers. She whispered into the stone each night, stories of forgotten queens and silent wars. She named the chains like old friends and braided her hair with symbols only the ancestors understood. She was preparing. Soon, those same guards who once mocked her began to sleep uneasily, waking with the taste of salt and ash on their tongues. The royal dogs refused to enter the dungeon stairs. And every night, just before the deepest dark, the palace above creaked, not from wind but from weight. Something moved below, something gathering. The new queen, sensing something unnatural, asked the king who lived beneath the floor. He waved her off, dismissing the dungeon as superstition and silence. "Let her rot," he said, "she has no voice left to curse me." But he was wrong. Nyasha's voice had never been her power, it was her silence that carried weight. And now, the silence had grown so loud that the mountain itself began to hum with it. The night before the king's wedding, the dungeon bloomed with light, not fire but pale blue strands of energy that snaked through the stone, pulsing with rhythm. One final guard, the only one brave enough to stand watch, saw Nyasha rise. The chains floated around her like feathers, no longer bound by rust or lock. Her eyes were closed, but tears streamed down her cheeks, each one glowing silver. "What are you?" he whispered. "I am what he feared," she replied softly. The storm he tried to cage. The wind he silenced. The laughter he buried. And as the palace above prepared for celebration, its foundation pulsed with song. A song forged in chains, grown in darkness and ready to rise. Years slid by like water over stone, washing away memories, softening the edges of what once stirred fear in the hearts of men. The king had grown older, his temples touched with gray, his eyes sharper and colder. The kingdom had changed, outwardly. There were more guards now, more walls, more alliances. But beneath the grand towers and gold-spired temples, the dungeon remained untouched. The girl, the one once called the Bride of the Storm, had been sealed off, out of sight, her cell left in silence, her name erased from records and tongues alike. In time, a new alliance emerged. A powerful kingdom across the sea had offered its youngest princess to marry the Mountain King, not for love, but to unify forces against a growing rebellion in the southern provinces. She was a rare jewel of diplomacy, known for her wit and beauty, with skin like coppered dusk and hair braided in rings of silver. Her name was Queen Sanyu. She arrived at the capital with 30 ships and a sea of offerings, her retinue shimmering in silks the color of thunderclouds. From the moment she stepped foot on the palace steps, strange things began to happen. The horses whinnied for no reason. The wind, though still, tugged sharply at the veils of the royal party. The moment Sanyu walked under the castle arch, a servant dropped the bridal chest. Inside, the wedding gown, a gift woven by monks over 10 years, let out a sound. Not a rip, not a sigh of fabric. It exhaled. Cold like breath long held in stone. The seamstress who opened the chest fainted before she could speak. Sanyu, poised and regal, raised no alarm. She was used to omens. Back home, her mother had taught her to read wind patterns and water shadows. But this palace, it breathed differently. The halls seemed to lean inward when she passed. The portraits shifted their eyes when she turned her back. And at night, when the castle was hushed and even the servants dared not whisper, the bells rang. Not loudly. Not all at once. But a single bell far below in the deep gut of the castle, where no chapel stood, where no hand could reach, let out a clear, high chime. Once. Then twice. Each night. At midnight. At first, the court blamed wind or a broken mechanism. But the bells beneath the palace hadn't worked in decades. They were remnants of the old city, buried and sealed. No one had touched them since the first stone of the king's rule was laid. And yet, every night as the moon passed the palace's highest spire, they rang. Sanyu began to dream. Vivid, unsettling dreams. Of a woman in a white gown, standing in water up to her knees, eyes closed, hair floating like it belonged to the air, not her head. Chains wrapped the woman's arms, but they were not cruel. They shimmered with power as though each link carried a story. In one dream, Sanyu heard her sing. Not in words, but in vibration. The same sound she once heard in her mother's stories when the elders called the spirits to the rain. She began to ask questions quietly. "Was there ever another queen before me?" she asked her handmaid. "No, my lady," came the rehearsed reply. "Only noble guests. No wives." "Was anyone ever kept in the dungeon?" "They say rebels were kept long ago. But no one now. It is sealed." But Sanyu felt it. Beneath her feet. At night, when she stood barefoot in her chamber, the floor trembled ever so slightly. The stone was not just cold, it was alive. It pulsed like something buried that had never died. The palace itself was uneasy. The wedding preparations moved forward, but with increasing delays. Flowers withered the moment they were placed on the altar. The ceremonial white horses refused to cross the palace bridge. A cook collapsed after hearing humming in the kitchen chimney, a melody that had no source, no singer. She awoke days later muttering about a girl with silver tears. The king dismissed it all. Old myths. Nervous minds. He cared only that the political marriage proceed. He instructed the court to fast-track the ceremony. But Sanyu, clever and calm, knew better than to rush a place that was speaking. On the eve of the wedding, Sanyu went to the royal seamstress to try on the gown. It had been sewn with hair from the sacred cows of the highlands, laced with gold thread prayers from 3 nations. But when she stepped into it, she gasped. It was cold. Not in a way silk should be. It was unnaturally cold, like ice dragged from a forgotten cave. It clung to her skin as if recognizing her. She saw her breath in the mirror though the room was warm. The dress shimmered once like it breathed, then lay still. A whisper followed. Not from the walls, not from her maids, but from the thread itself. She heard it in her blood. She never wore white. You will. Sanyu tore the gown from her skin and refused to sleep that night. Instead, she walked the palace halls barefoot, following the faint sound of bells that no one else admitted to hearing. They led her to a sealed corridor. Guarded. Padlocked. Dusty. The kind that history tries to bury, yet never quite forgets. I want it opened, she told the guards. They hesitated. It's forbidden, my queen. By whom? By the king. I outrank his memory. It took an hour of threats and royal seal for the door to be forced open. The corridor behind it exhaled a thick, moist breath like a lung that had waited years to breathe again. The torches hissed and Sanyu stepped in alone. Her shadow stretched behind her like a river. She walked past broken lamps, rotted benches, and finally reached the stairwell. It coiled downward endlessly, like a stone serpent burrowing into the earth's marrow. And at the bottom, silence. But not empty silence. It was the kind of silence that listens, that waits. And there she found it. A single cell. Its door warped by time. And inside, nothing at first. Just chains, unmoved but not forgotten. The walls glistened as if weeping. A smell of rain filled the space though none had fallen in days. Sanyu stepped forward. One of the chains moved. It did not rise. It reacted. As if sensing something familiar. It coiled slightly toward her feet and stopped. Then she saw her. A shape in the corner. Eyes open. Skin like midnight sky before a storm. Hair long, wild, but glinting with symbols, charms woven into strands. She did not blink. She did not breathe. But she was not dead. Sanyu whispered, "Who are you?" The woman finally blinked. "I was the storm he feared. And you are the one I waited for." That night the bells did not ring. They screamed. The palace had learned to ignore the dungeon. It was carved from the roots of the mountain itself, a place no light dared visit, a place the king never spoke of anymore. The girl, Nyasha, had become a myth, or so the courtiers liked to believe. A spiritual bride turned ghost. A ritual gone silent. A chain buried under stone. But one morning the cook dropped her ladle. She looked around, nothing was out of place. The oven hissed, the maid scrubbed the floors, and yet, the sound that had startled her hadn't been the clang of metal or the slap of wood. It had been music. Not from a lyre. Not from a flute. But a haunting, metallic harmony, something between a bell and a song. It came again that night. Deep beneath the palace floors a sound rose. It was faint at first. Like wind brushing hollow stone. Then it grew, slowly, rhythmically. The guards on the eastern corridor stood alert, their spears clutched tighter. They swore they heard it, a melody soft and deliberate. Metal striking metal, as if chains were dancing to an unseen rhythm. The king ignored the first report. Then the second. But by the third night, when the head guard himself reported, a melody that made my heart forget how to beat, the king grew pale. He ordered torches relit in the dungeon. Chains checked. Cell doors confirmed. But the moment the guards descended, torches in hand, something shifted. The first guard, a man who'd served the crown for 20 seasons, staggered out after just minutes. His eyes wide, mouth frothing with silent prayers. He could not speak. The others who followed were no better. One dropped his torch, mumbling something about voices inside the stone. Another screamed that the chains were speaking in Nyasha's voice, but her mouth was sealed shut. None dared return. The captain of the guard insisted it was mass hysteria. "They've heard old tales," he said. "Their minds betray them." Yet even he refused to descend alone. The king grew restless. His wedding to the new queen loomed, and already rumors spread, that the first bride had returned to curse the second, that the dungeon was singing rebellion, that the chains were calling for blood. In the great hall, mirrors cracked without reason. The wedding harp went missing, only to be found at the foot of the stairs leading to the dungeons, strung with rusted links instead of strings. The queen-to-be refused to wear the royal veil, saying it felt heavy with another woman's tears. She demanded the dungeon be purged, cleansed by fire and priest. And so, the king called for the priests. They arrived with incense, chants, and scrolls. Cloaked in red and white, they descended with bells tied to their ankles, chanting blessings in the old tongue. For hours the palace heard nothing. Then came the scream. It wasn't loud. It was long, piercing, endless. A sound that made skin crawl and blood chill. One priest returned, his robes torn, eyes bleeding, clutching a scrap of chain in his hand. He whispered, "She remembers the cold. She remembers the crown." He died before morning. Now panic swelled. Servants refused to clean near the stairwell. The royal dog refused to eat, barking only at the eastern wall. Children of the court began humming strange tunes in their sleep, unfamiliar rhythms, but eerily similar to the song rising from below. The king had had enough. He summoned his builders and ordered the dungeon sealed forever. Stone, cement, symbols, whatever it took. No sound, he said. No door. No breath. The masons worked quickly. By twilight, a thick wall of gray stone sealed the path. No torchlight could flicker beyond it. No footsteps would echo past. The chains would rattle no more. Except they did. That very night, when the final stone was placed, the palace bell, long rusted from disuse, began to ring. But not from above. From below. It was not a single tone but many. Braided together like a song hummed by 100 mouths with no lips. It weaved through the corridors like smoke. It touched the ears of the new queen who woke gasping, clutching her throat. "She's coming," she whispered to the mirror, though she didn't know who. In the servants' quarters, a boy scrawled circles on the floor with charcoal, murmuring, "She danced in chains that bled light." When asked who he meant, he replied, "The girl the storm kissed." Even the walls could not stop the melody. The stone seemed to carry it further, echoing it louder. It seeped into teacups, into curtains, into the very bones of the palace. The king held a midnight council. "We will say nothing," he ordered. "Let no story of this reach the people. She is gone. Buried. Myth." But across the city, women reported waking with shackles of light wrapped around their ankles, vanishing when touched. Blacksmiths claimed their hammers moved without hands. One old man swore he saw a girl walking past the river, blindfolded, her laughter carrying thunderclouds behind her. The king still wore a smile in court. But behind closed doors he began to tremble. He could not sleep. Every night he dreamed of a chain wrapped around his chest, tightening, pulling him down to where her voice hummed like a lullaby twisted into grief. The royal musicians refused to perform at the wedding, fearing the other song would rise through their instruments. When forced to play, they produced melodies they didn't recognize, notes that made the queen's eyes water and guests shift uncomfortably in their seats. Then came the whisper. It began as a rumor. A servant claimed she saw the wedding goblet shiver on its own. Another claimed the queen's dress sang to her. But the most terrifying report came from the king's scribe. In the royal scroll room, every document about Nyasha, her name, her initiation, even her birth, turned blank. The ink dissolved. Only one word remained on all of them: below. That night the song changed. No longer soft. No longer patient. It became a dirge. A thundering, ghostly orchestra of grief and fury. And woven through it was a woman's voice, wordless but unmistakable. It rose through the stone floors. It bent the chandeliers. It cracked the mirror in the bridal chamber. The wedding night arrived. The moon, full and red, hung over the mountain. The guests were dressed in gold. The bride was radiant, her crown a forest of gemstones. But the king did not smile. Because as the couple stood at the altar, as the priest lifted his hand to bless the union, a single chime rang out. Clear. Loud. From beneath their feet. The room froze. Then came the second chime. Then the third. Then hundreds. The rhythm was undeniable. It was the same melody that had haunted the palace for weeks. But louder. Closer. Like it had crawled its way up, link by link, chain by chain. The floor cracked. Not visibly, not yet, but the tremble could be felt. Glasses clinked on their own. The altar candle sputtered and died. The bride fainted. And from the shadowed corners of the hall came the final sound. A laugh. Not cruel. Not mocking. But ancient. like the earth itself exhaling after holding its breath too long. Then silence. The king ordered everyone out. The wedding was postponed. But no one spoke of it afterward. No one dared. Because even when the guests returned to their homes, even when the hall was scrubbed clean, the melody remained, soft, almost tender, like a lullaby from chains that once held love captive but now carried prophecy. They say the king sleeps with his boots on now. That he cannot remove his crown for fear it may whisper back. That he walks with one ear pressed to the. On the day of the royal wedding, the sun rose heavy and red, as though it bled from the horizon itself. The sky held no clouds and yet the air was thick, too thick like it waited for something to happen. In the palace, servants bustled to prepare, their footsteps hurried and hushed. No one said it aloud but all felt it, something was wrong. Inside the queen's chamber, the foreign princess stood before a tall mirror, her eyes wide and pale. She was wrapped in fine silks, her hair woven with moonstones. But her hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the table. "It's cold," she whispered. The handmaiden, startled, blinked. "Your Highness, the sun is out." "No," the bride said, turning slowly. "The gown. It's freezing." The handmaiden touched the fabric and pulled away. It was cold, unnaturally so, as if dipped in river ice. And then, from somewhere below the palace, came a faint sound, the ringing of chains. It started slow, a clink and drag, then quickened like footsteps. It was unmistakable, though no one spoke of it any more. The sound of chains that once bound Nyasha, the girl the king had locked away and forgotten. But her name was never uttered. Not in the palace. Not since the dungeon door was sealed shut, iron upon iron, stone upon stone. Still the sound returned. The handmaiden fled the chamber in a panic, leaving the bride alone. The princess turned back to the mirror. Behind her reflection, in the shadows of the room, a figure flickered. A silhouette swaying, almost dancing as the sound of clinking metal filled the air. At the same time, across the palace, the king dressed in his ceremonial robes. He stood tall and silent, eyes fixed on his crown. His advisors praised his vision, uniting two kingdoms, forging alliances, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He hadn't slept. For 3 nights, a voice had whispered in his dreams, soft and melodic. A voice he hadn't heard in years. A voice that once made the wind pause and rivers calm. Nyasha. He thought of her only in shadows, only in guilt he refused to name. But now her voice was everywhere, behind closed doors, beneath his feet, even in the silence between breaths. He waved his hand. "Light the torches," he commanded. But as the palace staff moved to obey, something shifted. One by one the torches sputtered out. The flames, healthy moments ago, hissed and died like they were being smothered by unseen hands. The golden halls were thrown into darkness. Panic erupted. Servants dropped their trays. Musicians halted mid-practice. Guests murmured and looked to the sky. Outside, clouds had gathered. Thick and violent. The sun was gone. Lightning flashed, but no thunder followed. Just the distant rattle of chains, echoing through stone. In the royal chapel, musicians lifted their drums to begin the wedding procession. But before a single note struck, the drums began to thrum on their own. A low beat, steady and grim. The leather skins vibrated like breath had entered them. The drummers backed away in horror. Still the beat continued. Boom, boom, boom. Chains answered in rhythm. From below. In the bridal chamber, the princess collapsed, eyes wide in terror. She had tried to run, but the gown grew heavier with each step. It felt like hands held it down. She screamed when the bells above the palace began to ring, though no ropes were pulled. The sound of the bells merged with the rhythm of the drums and chains, creating a music none could understand. It was both beautiful and terrifying, like mourning sung by spirits who remembered too much. Guards were dispatched, but none returned. The king strode into the chapel, his face pale. He looked up at the altar, then down the long aisle where his bride had yet to appear. He opened his mouth to speak, but the breath caught in his throat. For down the aisle, from the entrance doors, came the sound of dragging. Not feet. Not fabric. Chains. They slid and clinked and rang against the stone floor. And then came her voice. Soft. Calm. Echoing. "You have taken what was not yours," the voice said. "But still you celebrate." The doors of the chapel swung open with a thunderous bang. Wind howled through the halls. Candles blew out. Flowers shriveled. In the doorway stood no one, and yet the chains moved forward. One by one, guests rose from their seats, backs stiff, eyes wide. Some turned to flee, but the doors shut behind them. They were locked in with a memory that refused to die. From the shadows between the pews, whispers rose. She was the bride of the storm. Her laughter calmed the skies. She gave him power. And he locked her in chains. The king staggered back. His crown slid sideways on his head. In the silence that followed, the invisible chains reached the altar. There before the king they coiled on the ground. Then they rose, twisting in the air like snakes. They circled him slowly, pulsing with an energy that made the chandeliers above rattle. The chains began to hum, not in metal but in voice. A song rose from them, sung in Nyasha's voice. It was the lullaby she used to hum in her chamber when she still believed the king would keep his promises. It was the lullaby that stopped thunder and stilled lightning. Now it carried rage beneath its sweetness. A single link of chain lashed toward the king's crown. It knocked it to the ground. The metal rang sharply, and then silence. From the edge of the crowd, an elder stepped forward. His eyes were wide with awe, not fear. "The dungeon sings," he whispered. And she answers. The bride was carried in, still unconscious, her skin cold to the touch. Her attendants wept, unable to wake her. The royal wedding was over before it began. In the days that followed, no one could find the source of the chains. No passage led to the dungeon anymore, yet the sound continued. The palace floors trembled at night. Mirrors fogged with breath not one's own. Paintings aged in minutes. And always the chains sang. Some say the king no longer sleeps. That he paces the chapel floors at night, whispering apologies to a spirit he cannot see. Some say they see a figure standing at the highest tower window, not the queen, not the king, but a woman with wind in her hair and chains trailing behind her. Others claim the dungeon was never under the palace at all, but beneath the king's very soul. But all agree on one thing. When the drums play themselves, and chains rattle with no master, it is Nyasha reminding the world. You cannot bury a storm. They said the wedding would seal a golden era, that the foreign queen's beauty would soften the hard edge of the mountainous kingdom and that the king's cruelty would fade beneath her charm. But that night, in the grand hall where marble floors glimmered with spilled wine and laughter, the air turned cold, the kind of cold that came from forgotten grief and chains buried too long in silence. It began when the palace bells rang on their own, each clang trembling like it had been struck by an unseen hand. The guests froze mid-toast, silver goblets halfway to lips. A hush swept through the hall like a ghost inhaling every sound. Then, with the slow creak of ancient hinges, the doors to the great hall swung open, not with force but as though they bowed to what approached. Nyasha stepped through. She was barefoot. Her gown was tatters of shadow woven into cloth. Her chains dragged across the stone floor, not heavy, but singing, ringing like dozens of tiny bells that once lay dormant in the dungeon's dark. Her face was the same as the day she'd been locked away, yet different. No hunger, no fear, no hate. Just a terrible calm. And her eyes glowed with a light that was not of this world. It wasn't fire nor starlight but something older, colder, truer. No one spoke. The guards at the door dropped their spears without knowing why. The noblemen clutched their wives' hands. The queen-to-be clutched her throat, eyes wide, tears running over flawless cheeks. Nyasha didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence moved through the room like an unseen wave, and when it touched the guests, it peeled back the veils they wore over their memories. One by one, every guest saw something no one else could see. The old merchant from the southern province saw a girl he'd disowned for falling in love with a slave, and how she died giving birth alone in the snow. The general who'd once led men into the east saw the face of a boy who had surrendered but was killed anyway. The maid who smiled and bowed saw the bruises she hid under sleeves and the child she gave away because no one would help her. Each crime, each secret, each sin. Not shouted, not accused, only shown, reflected. The ballroom became a chamber of weeping, gasping, groveling souls. Guests fell to their knees. Some screamed. Some begged forgiveness for things they'd never spoken aloud. And yet, through it all, Nyasha said nothing. She only walked, her chains humming with memories, her steps as steady as the storm that once bowed to her laughter. And then there was the king. He stood at the head of the table, a golden crown upon his head, robes stitched with threads of sapphire. He had tried to forget her. Had told himself she was a myth, a dream, a girl swallowed by time and stone. But here she was. No longer chained in darkness, but walking beneath chandeliers that dimmed in her presence. He didn't see the glow of her eyes. He saw the room shift. The pillars melted into vines. The goblets dripped with blood. The throne behind him cracked like an egg leaking black water. And when Nyasha finally looked his way, not with accusation but with pity, his knees gave way. He dropped, hard, arms splayed like a broken puppet. "My lady," he whispered. His voice was raw, confused, desperate. "You're dead." "I had no choice. I had to." "You wouldn't obey." Nyasha didn't answer. Her chains rattled once, loud and clear, and from the darkened ceiling, a rope descended like a snake, tied with the king's own crest at the knot. It hovered over him like judgment carved in the air. The guests drew back. None dared help him. The new queen-to-be, now trembling, dared to speak. "Please," she said to Nyasha, tears dripping. "Please don't hurt us. We didn't know. We thought you were gone." Nyasha turned toward her. Her glowing eyes flickered once. The girl fell silent, suddenly seeing something in Nyasha's presence. Not horror, not rage, but a reflection of the girl she could have become if trapped in stone walls and left without a voice. And then, from the cracks in the floor, the chains rose. Not one or two. Dozens. They slithered like silver vines, wrapping gently around the feet of the king, coiling up his arms. He shrieked, but they didn't burn or crush. They held him firm. Nyasha stepped close now, so close that he could see the shimmer of the storm in her pupils. And then, at last, she spoke. "Did you think silence meant consent?" The room recoiled. Her voice wasn't loud. It was soft, like mist curling into a scream. And yet, everyone heard it, even the ones who tried to plug their ears. The king whimpered. "Please, you were born for the spirits. You stopped the storms. I gave you honor." Nyasha's chains pulsed. "You gave me a cell. I gave you purpose. You gave me rust and rot. You were chosen," he sobbed. Her hand rose, palm facing him. "And now, so are you." The chains around him tightened, then softened, then sank into his skin, becoming part of him. His robes turned to dust. His crown fell and cracked on the floor. And in its place, a ring of glowing mist circled his head, a cursed halo of guilt and grief. Then Nyasha turned away. She walked back through the room, and the guests parted like shadows before moonlight. As she passed, the fires and the torches reignited. The stone walls breathed again. The air warmed. But every person who looked at her felt something tighten in their chest. Not fear, but a reminder. The forgotten will not stay forgotten. And just before she vanished through the open doors, she turned her face slightly to the side and whispered a final word. One that only the king could hear. "Listen for the chains. I'll be near." The doors slammed shut. The light returned. But the palace was not the same. The wedding never happened. The new queen returned to her land and never spoke of that night again. The king? He remained seated on the cracked floor, blind and trembling. And every night after, the castle echoed with the clatter of chains no one could see, and songs in the dark that warned, justice does not forget. Not even in silence. Not even in shadow. The palace walls no longer carried the king's voice. The once powerful man, whose shout had made commanders tremble and whose whispers had sealed fates, now sat in silence on the cold marble floor. His mouth opened but nothing emerged, no sound, no plea, no command. The very air seemed to deny him breath. Above him, on the obsidian throne once carved for rulers of flame and steel, sat Nyasha. Her figure was wrapped in still living shadows that twisted and shifted like silent serpents. Chains coiled gently around her limbs and draped from her shoulders, but they no longer bound, they adorned. Each link shimmered faintly in the flickering candlelight, humming a tune that only the guilty seemed to hear. No crown was placed upon her head, and yet, none questioned her rule. The courtiers, nobles and soldiers gathered in the hall had fallen to their knees. Not out of duty nor fear but something far older, reverence. In Nyasha's presence, truth became unbearable. One by one, they had looked into her eyes and seen the reflection of their own hidden sins. She had said nothing. She did not need to. Her silence was a mirror and it shattered them. Days passed but the hall never emptied. Food was brought but not to feast, only to sustain those who now lived in repentance within the palace. The throne room became something like a shrine, a confessional without words. People came from beyond the mountains, peasants with calloused hands, widows with empty stares, children who had been born into whispers. They came not to speak but to be seen. And Nyasha saw them all. The chains that once clattered in rebellion now swayed in harmony with her breath. Sometimes they rang without movement, like wind chimes touched by a phantom breeze. Some claimed they whispered. Others said they remembered. A servant girl, barely 15, fell to her knees and wept when she entered the hall. Her village had accused her of theft. Her hands still bore the scars. Nyasha did not move, but the chains quivered, and the wind carried a sound like a lullaby. That night, The girl dreamed of her innocence being carried on the wings of crows, and when she awoke, she spoke without stammering for the first time since her trial. An old general arrived days later, carried on a litter. His body was twisted by time and war, his eyes cloudy with the ghosts of men he had left to die for glory. When he saw Nyasha, he bowed so low his forehead touched the stone. For 3 days he did not rise, and when he finally did, he cast his medals into the fire and walked into the wilderness, never to return. The foreign queen who had once fainted on the wedding night, never left the palace. She became Nyasha's shadow, never speaking above a whisper. She often sat at Nyasha's side, hands folded, eyes lowered. Some said she was learning how to rule not with force but with listening. Others said she simply could not bear to be out of Nyasha's sight. The king, once feared, once praised, was never seen again outside the throne room. He remained near the base of the throne, mute, feeding himself from simple bowls of broth placed by servants who dared not look at him. His crown had vanished. Some believed it had been absorbed into the chains. Others whispered that Nyasha wore it beneath her skin, melted into her bones. The throne itself changed. Its hard black stone softened with each day Nyasha sat upon it. Moss began to grow at its base as though the land itself had recognized a new era. Birds flew through open windows and perched along the carved arches. Light entered the hall at strange angles, illuminating things that had long been hidden. In one corner of the chamber, a mural slowly revealed itself on its own. Images of a girl in chains standing before a howling storm, her silence louder than thunder. People began to call her the Echo Queen. Not because she spoke but because she heard. All who entered that space left lighter, their burdens unspoken but understood. And in return, Nyasha said nothing. She only listened, and in her listening the palace became a sanctuary. The dungeons were unsealed, but no prisoners remained. Not a single soul. Only chains, curled like sleeping serpents, and the memory of songs that had once rung in the dark. No one could explain it. No one tried. One evening a child approached the throne, barefoot and clutching a wooden toy carved in the shape of a bird. She offered it silently to Nyasha and then climbed into her lap without permission. The chains parted for her like petals. Nyasha smiled, not with lips but with presence, and the whole court wept without knowing why. From that day on no one called the throne room a court. It became known as the Hall of Echoes. Justice was no longer decreed but reflected. Those who sought power avoided it. Those who sought peace were drawn to it. The foreign kingdoms sent gifts, ambassadors, and priests to understand the new queen. But none returned with words. Only silence. Some cut out their own tongues, saying language was too small for what they had witnessed. And as for Nyasha, the one once locked away beneath the earth, she never moved from her place. She ruled from stillness, from memory, from the chains that now glimmered like constellations across her body. Some nights, when the wind blew just right, the chains rang out again, not in warning but in harmony as though they sang to the stars themselves. They say her silence taught the kingdom how to speak again. Not with words but with truth. And beneath the mountain moon, children still whisper a lullaby. Where the chains once wept, now echoes sleep. The queen who listens hears secrets deep. Not all who are silent are ever blind. For the Echo Queen sees with every mind. The bells no longer tolled on the night of her wedding. Instead, chains rang across the land, soft at first like wind-touched metal, then louder, sharper like warning drums echoing through bone. Every year on that night the sound returned. It was not a sound born of this world. Once it marked a union. Now it marked a curse. The people called it the wedding song of the damned. No one truly knew where the chains hung or who struck them. There were no towers, no bells, no musicians. And yet, when the night came, the exact night Nyasha had been given to the foreign king, the air would vibrate with the chilling melody of unseen chains. And with it came consequences. In the years that followed her return and silent coronation, Nyasha never spoke of that night. But the kingdom never forgot. Whispers spread quickly after the first wedding ended in disaster. A nobleman's daughter screaming at the altar when her groom's affair with her sister surfaced mid-vow. No one had spoken. No one had told. But something had revealed it. That was the first. Then another. A merchant's son stood frozen, mouth open, as the bride spoke words not hers, but his cruel, mocking words he had once said about her when drunk. She fled the ceremony barefoot, never to be seen again. After the third, the priests convened. They concluded the truth. Nyasha's curse was not vengeance, it was justice. Every year, on the anniversary of her wedding, the chains sang. And every wedding held on that night would be tested. Truth or unraveling. At first, people tried to avoid the date. They moved ceremonies, fasted, prayed. But time in its indifferent way circled back. Couples forgot, or challenged it, or believed themselves immune. They were not. Now, a tradition had formed, not through royal decree but collective survival. Before any wedding, the couple was required to enter the Hall of Echoes and kneel before the throne. There, before the silent Echo Queen, they would speak 3 truths. One about themselves, one about their partner, and one they had never spoken aloud. Nyasha never replied. She only listened. But if one lied, the chains knew. They would not ring immediately. They waited. Only when the vows were spoken did the song begin. It began like breath, a soft whisper of metal brushing against itself. Then it spread, down streets, through fields, into the windows of the ceremony. Guests would pause. The wind would change direction. Birds would silence. Candles would flicker without flame. And then the voice would rise, not from Nyasha but through her. It was not a voice of anger. It was mournful. It sang the truth the couple tried to bury. Always the exact words. Always in the exact tone they had been spoken. It could be a cruel insult said behind a door. A betrayal whispered in the dark. A hesitation buried in the heart. When it was done, the silence that followed was heavier than stone. Some couples survived it, emerging stronger, even grateful. But most did not. And so the wedding song of the damned became feared, but respected. Families no longer hid secrets. They forced truth into the light. Lovers shared their worst memories before ever reaching for gold bands. And it changed the kingdom. Not with laws, but with listening. A historian once said Nyasha reshaped an empire without a single decree. Only presence. Only chains. Only silence that hummed with memory. One year, a defiant duke decided to mock the tradition. He and his bride-to-be announced their wedding for the very night the chains sang. "We fear no ghost queen," he laughed at a feast, "and we have no secrets." The Hall of Echoes stood open to all. They refused to enter. The bride, a kind-hearted woman with eyes too gentle for palace walls, had asked him to at least offer the 3 truths. He had refused. "The past is dead," he said. But on the night of the wedding, as the officiant raised their hands to bless the union, the sound came, slow and steady, like chains being lifted from a deep, deep well. Then the voice came. But this time, it wasn't Nyasha's. It was hers. The bride's. Her voice, repeating things she had said to herself in her grief, in her doubt, in her fears of the duke's coldness. She collapsed before the final vow, clutching her chest, and whispered, "I never wanted this." The chains ceased. The wedding did not continue. She left the palace that night with her shoes in her hand and the entire court watching in silence. The duke was never seen again. Some said he vanished into the sea. Others whispered that the Echo Queen had let him hear all the voices he had silenced, at once. But the song wasn't just a warning. For some, it was a blessing. One year, a soldier and a weaver entered the Hall of Echoes. They knelt before Nyasha, trembling, and spoke their truths. "I was ashamed of loving a man," the soldier said. "I once prayed you would die in war so I wouldn't have to be brave," the weaver said. "I sometimes feel like I don't deserve to be loved," the soldier whispered. The hall did not ring. On their wedding night, no chains stirred. Instead, the wind carried the faintest melody, a soft hum like comfort. And all who heard it wept with peace. From that day forward it became clear. Nyasha's song was not just for punishment. It was a mirror. A mirror made of chain, silence, and memory. As the decades passed, the tradition evolved. Now children were taught not just how to speak, but how to listen. How to offer their truths early. How to sit in the silence of another's pain. And on the night the chains sang each year, the kingdom paused. No bells rang. No music played. But the people would gather in small groups, family, friends, lovers, and share stories. Some read letters they had never dared to send. Some lit candles for those who had left with unspoken words. Some sat in silence and let the chains ring through their bones. It was not mourning. It was remembering. In this way, Nyasha became something more than queen. More than legend. More than ghost. She became ritual. She became truth made sacred. One day, a child asked a question in the Hall of Echoes. Why chains? The Echo Queen did not answer. But the chains at her feet swayed gently as if stirred by thought. And then the child heard it, a voice not from Nyasha's mouth but from the chain itself. To bind is to imprison. To break is to forget. But to carry is to remember. The child nodded and placed a single thread of her hair upon the throne. So we remember. From that day, Young couples braided a single chain link into their wedding clothes. Not to challenge the song but to honor it. To remember that love is not proof against secrets. But truth is proof against decay. And so, every year on the night of Nyasha's broken wedding, the kingdom does not hide. It listens. It confesses. It heals. And somewhere in the Hall of Echoes, beneath stone and silence, the Echo Queen watches. Chains coiled around her like memory. Voice still stolen but never powerless. For her song, the wedding song of the damned, still sings. But now it sings not just of punishment, but of becoming whole.